Today's March 9th, 2018. We're really delighted to welcome you, Joanna Hoffman, back to the Computer History Museum. Marguerite, Gong, Hancock, together with Hansen and Marc of the museum. And we're delighted to have you here for part 2 of your oral history. Today we'll be focusing on your time with the Mac team at Apple, moving on to Next. Hansen will be leading that portion. Marc will be leading the portion on General Magic, and then I'll be closing up with a review of your career and work afterwards. Of course, we'll be very interactive, but we're really delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a privilege. I can't even imagine doing this, but I'm very excited to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So to start off, could you maybe talk a little bit about Steve Jobs' charisma and the reality distortion field?
You know, because Steve had a very strong vision of what he intended to do, and I don't want to label him as a mere visionary because, frankly speaking, you know, visionaries are 1 in a million. People who are able to bring visions into reality and make them successful and make them stick are 1 in a billion, and he was definitely 1 in a billion. So I would say that his primary charisma was his own unwavering faith in what should be done, what was the right thing to do, his ability to make decisions, never really waffling, and being so certain of what is the right course to take. And there was another dimension to it, which was there was no self-interest. Steve was never doing it for himself, was not doing it for the money, was not doing it for the fame, was not doing, you know, he was doing it because he had the strong sense that this is the right thing to do and that it's going to change the world. It's been said so many times now, it's such a cliche, but he really felt that technology and his participation in bringing that technology to the world could really make a huge difference. And so I think all of those things were very compelling. But, you know, you can have that in many people, but I think he just had an innate, born magnetism. And that is something that you can't really explain. You can't find a word for it. You know, this is not... someday maybe we'll decipher it, but we don't know. You know, what is it that when somebody walks into the room, they have that magnetism, and other people walk into the room and they don't, you know? So, and he definitely did have that. And one other thing I should mention about him, I think that many people misunderstand and misunderstood at the time as well, is that you know, what they took to be slights and insults on his part were merely the fact that he never rested on his own laurels. So people's past accomplishments were of really very little interest to him. What he wanted to know is, what can you do for the future? And so there were a lot of people who felt like, well, he's not acknowledging my work in the past. But Steve never looked back and said, well, you know, I was instrumental in the Apple II, or after he did the Macintosh, that I've done the Macintosh. He never talked about PICs. He never talked about his past accomplishments. He only talked about what he intended to do for the future. So the fact that he never rested on his laurels was misunderstood by a lot of people to mean that he doesn't appreciate what they have done or their contributions or whatever. Every time you were working on a new project with Steve, you were starting with a clean slate. So, you know, and it disturbs some people. It's like, well, I've done this and I've done that. And some people even thought, well, I did this for you, which he never thought of it that way. You know, we're all doing it for a cause, and then that cause is in the past. Now we look toward the future. You know, so I would say that those were some of the very compelling characteristics of Steve's personality, but that could also have another side to them, which is that people who couldn't deal with it had a hard time.
Steve had very clear vision, but sometimes that vision might have been clouded by missing certain things. So the famous reality distortion field, maybe he sometimes refused to see things that were there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think one of his main failings was to acknowledge time, you know, to acknowledge the permanence of time, that it's not shrinkable. You know, I'm always late for things, and if people tell me that I think time is elastic. Well, Steve always felt that time was compressible, and so therefore, I think most of the unreality of what of his management style, the reality distortion, so to speak, what had to do with timing. He always thought that it can be done in less time and in a much more efficient manner than was realistic. So that was number one. Number two, sometimes, and this was definitely the case during, I think, my experience with Steve at Apple and at Next, which he shed in the future when he came back to Apple, was the fact that he had this unwavering faith in technology and in new technologies. So his commitment to the Laserdisc, for example, at Next, where it just the technology never really.
The optical drive, yeah.
The optical drive, yeah, which it just never came to be what it could have been, but that was not the right technology. So there were those kinds of blind spots, but I think you know, with experience and with the wisdom, he actually became much more realistic and much more able to cohere things together that made sense and were appropriate for the time.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about some of those decisions in the design of the Mac? Say, like omitting cursor keys or keeping the amount of RAM down, things that would affect the users that he was very insistent on.
I should back up a little bit and give some context, because at the time when we started the Macintosh project, there was a project going on at Apple called Lisa Project. And Lisa was supposed to be a business computer where it met the needs of knowledge workers and people in the offices. It was more expandable. It had a large keyboard with cursor keys and everything. And when we started the Macintosh project, we had to justify to Apple why it looked so much like the Lisa in terms of its user experience and user interface, even though it wasn't compatible and it wasn't identical. It was much more pared down in some ways. It was also an improvement in other ways because we had learned from the Lisa experience as well. And so, and Steve, the difference between the two was in that the Macintosh was supposed to be an appliance for everyday user, where the Lisa was a business machine. Of course, a computer as an appliance, as almost like a consumer device, was visionary, but not quite right for the market at the time, right? There wasn't enough yet to make it a consumer device. It wasn't cheap enough. The technology wasn't advanced enough. There was a slight mismatch, right? But that mismatch also came from the fact that we had to tell Apple that we were not going to cannibalize the Lisa. Which, by the way, is a fallacy that is so common to companies in that they try to position their product so they don't cannibalize each other, and the competition ends up coming in and cannibalizing your product for you, right? You should never do that, really. Don't second guess the market. Do two, three, whatever products the best that they can be. But alas, we were hampered that way. We had that constraint in that we had to make the Macintosh very distinct from the Lisa. And the distinctions were that it was smaller, more limited in capability, closed machine, you know, not expandable, and all of the limitations that that you got on the Macintosh were really driven by that very initial executive committee meeting where we got permission to go ahead and make the Macintosh, where we had to make slides differentiating the two, and that set the course for us into the future. So in an odd way, this was not something that I would lay at the doorstep of Steve. I would lay it at the doorstep of the corporate reality of Apple at the time.
On cannibalization, so obviously the Mac purposely was not compatible with the Apple II in any way, whereas like the 2GS, which came a bit later, was, you know, a GUI, WYSIWYG version of the two. Was there any thought at the time of Mac that, I mean, that was another product, a much more important product for Apple at the time that could potentially be cannibalized? Was there any thinking about that?
You know, I think when that happened, by that time, I think there was no. I may be mistaken. I
don't mean the 2GS time. I'm saying at the time of the Mac, was there any talk of trying to make it run Apple II stuff at all?
No.
Okay.
No. It was supposed to be a total departure from the past and only looking into the future. Okay. So no. Never. There was never a talk of any kind of compatibility backward. Yeah.
So could you talk about the human interface guidelines that you wrote? And just
that was done out of just a pure necessity, because unlike the Lisa, actually, which had its own whole set of products that were going to ship, productivity software that was going to ship with the Lisa, we were more in the Apple II tradition in a sense that we were going to rely on third-party developers, right? And from the very beginning, we started approaching third-party developers, the first being Microsoft. And so that, then as we got more steam, and it turned out we were much more popular than we had any right to be with attracting third-party developers. And here I'll put in a plug for my husband, Alan Rossman, who was out there being ultra-techy and simply seducing people with the technology. And they forgot their business intuitions while, you know, getting all caught up in how wonderful the technology was, and actually made commitments to work on the Macintosh. And all of a sudden, we were starting to see that people were, because we didn't have yet everything, all the tools to give them, well, yet. We were seeing that people's mentality was still in the days of the Apple II or the IBM PC, which was, we are going to make things a little later on, the IBM PC. But anyway, at any rate, at that time, the model was, we're going to do what's right for our software and everything else be damned. But the whole premise of the Macintosh was that there was going to be consistency, that going from application to application, you didn't have to relearn things, you know. One day I just sat down and I thought, we need to give these people some guidelines and also tell them what's already built into the machine, into the ROM, because we were trying to encourage them to do this. The overall memory was constrained. So if you could use what's already in RAM, you did not have to use extra memory. So we had to document what was in RAM, what you can use, and how will it look, and how you should desire it to look if you want to develop for the Macintosh. So a Walkman, a pair of earphones, and Mozart. And I sat there day and night and cranked it out. And I'm not a technical writer, so, you know, it had flaws. But at least we had something that we could hand to people. And I was advocating at the time that we really need to get a writer on board to be able to flesh it all out, and it's really time to do that. And we were very fortunate in getting Caroline Rose, who wrote the famous telephone book of all the technical documentation for the Macintosh, and she was fantastic. So she really deserves the credit. My first initial draft, I would call it maybe, was purely for the developers that we had at hand at the time. So,
can you give a little more detail about how long were you listening to Mozart with your head? Was the length of time, and
I
about
think
how many
it
developers?
I think it took me less than a week. Yeah, but people were walking by and saying, "What are you doing?" You know, I was sitting there. I'm not that fast a typist, but I became one writing that user interface document, and so I stayed there long hours, you know, and cranked it out, and just we were able to hand it out.
Did the guideline become too strict or dogmatic for later on?
Oh, yeah, of course. You know, like any dogma, right? Yeah, like any doctrine, I should say. Like any doctrine, once it becomes dogma, it becomes counterproductive. And the doctrine of our user interface became a dogma for much longer than it should have been, because there is no way we could have foreseen some of the applications that were coming from all these creative minds outside of Apple. And inside Apple, too, there were some very creative people. So we should have I would say it wasn't our generation anymore. It was the next generations that stuck to it because that's what it should be, as opposed to, well, let's see how it should be modified for the new generation of software that is coming down the line, for some really incredibly innovative things that are being done, and maybe they're better, and let's give some flexibility. But because our user interface, the guidelines that I wrote also evolved. As third parties were doing new things, we learned from them, and we put new things into the software and also into the guidelines. I know you can do it this way or that way. What you don't want is, you know, cut, copy, paste to appear in 20 different places and spread out, you know, because once you have a graphical user interface, people really work by spatial orientation, and you don't want to switch things around willy-nilly. So there are some, scroll bars should work the same way in every application. Some things that obviously should become second nature to the users. But there are other things that you are incorporating, and there maybe it's voice, maybe there are other alternative ways of looking at things other than graphically, and whatever, you know, new search ways, mechanisms, and you should be able to modify things as you go along. But you know, this is always a problem when something is seen as revolutionary at the time. Is that people who take the mantle of that tend to ossify it. So I think, yes, that did become the case. But I don't think Apple was an exception in that area. I think many people did the same thing. You know? But now it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. Every time I go to use a piece of software, I have no idea what it's going to look like, because some 18-year-old at Google had decided that this is how he's going to change it, or she's going to change it. and with no, forewarning, no reason, nothing. And all of a sudden, and everyone complains about that, but you know what? Because it's free, people are putting up with the shit. And so, but the Macintosh wasn't free. and neither were its successors. So, so you had to make it so that the users don't complain.
In a related sort of dogma, the Mac is often compared to a religion or a cult. How much of, from the user base, how much of that was a deliberate strategy from marketing to actually try to foment that?
I think we were actually surprised ourselves by it. Now, one thing I should say is that we may have been surprised. I don't know if Steve was surprised, because the Apple II had become a cult. So he had lived through that already, and he knew that if you give people something that had a personality, even if that, an inanimate object with a personality could garner a cult following. And that's what we did with the Macintosh as well. Give that little twinkle, some things were unexpected. There were buried little messages here and there, and there was just a personality to the machine. So I think, in that sense, I don't know that it was intentional, but it was something we enjoyed doing, right? But it may have been intentional on the part of Steve. But a lot of the things that went into the Macintosh were not dictated by Steve, but he would come and see that people had done it and say, well, that's great, But so I'd say it was at that level. As far as the marketing itself and making it, I don't think that there was any profound premeditation. I don't think you can actually create that out of thin air. You have to have a basis for the attraction, right? People have to be really attracted and get emotionally engaged with the technology in order for you to be able to create that. You can't just create it out of thin air. It's not sugar water.
Could you talk about, so you were the first marketing person for the Macintosh. Could you talk about how the group, you built out the group and, working with people like Mike Murray and Mike Boych?
Yes. So, it became clear that we needed more people, obviously. And I think it was, I'm very bad with dates, but I think it was in '82 that we started hiring additional marketing people. And the first marketing head of marketing that we hired was Barry Cash. I don't know how well known that is. But Barry was living in Texas, I believe, so he was commuting from Texas. And Steve really liked him and got along with him, and so he wanted Barry to be the head of the overall marketing umbrella. But the thing is that he couldn't do it part-time, and so Barry at some point said, you got to hire more people. So we, with help, Barry was actively involved in hiring Mike Murray, and then Mike brought in Mike Boych, and we just loved Mike. Both Mikes, but Mike Boych was, being very technical and ultra brilliant, frankly, was immediately embraced by the engineering team. And you couldn't get anybody if they were not embraced by the engineering team. The engineering had to love them. And so, Mike Murray's incredible sense of humor and sort of the creative twinkle really appealed to everybody. So we, and neither one of them had particularly long resumes of having done marketing, but they were product people, both of them. especially Mike Boych. And so it was really fun being able to work with them. I had become obsessed at that point with education and international, and so I wanted to really focus on those things. So it was really nice to have Mike Boych, who was also working with third parties, and he was technical enough to be able to give them all the answers and talk to our engineering and give feedback and so on. So that was great. And Mike Murray was extremely creative, so he could work with all the agencies and our internal Apple Marcom team. So it was great. It was a really fun group.
So speaking of Marcom, working with Chiat Day and also with Regis McKenna, were you involved in that at all?
I was initially, because we did a lot of brainstorming at first. That was, and the other reason why I was involved is because I needed to make sure that we have consistency between what was happening here and what would be happening abroad. So, yes, I was involved, and I got all the copy and got to comment on everything that was being produced. I was just not the primary interface with them. It wasn't my thing, to be honest with you. But it was very intriguing and was fun, but it wasn't. I was more focused in working with on the product side. Yeah, and I should also mention that the day we got Barbara Colkin, I think, was the day when Macintosh went from being a research project to being a product, because those introductions, the timelines, the just the cohesion of it all coming together would not have happened without her. That was she was just amazing. It was the first time I had ever met anybody like that, no ego whatsoever, and all she cared about is making it real and introducing it and doing a really great job at it and uncompromising. I was just in awe of her abilities. And to this day, she never will tout her horn. She's just not that kind of person. And when you tell her all the accomplishments of her accomplishments, she goes, "Oh, really?" It's just amazing. So, yeah, she was incredible. Is incredible, still. So.
You mentioned wanting to work more on education and international. Could you talk about deciding to go into those areas?
So when we first wrote, by we I mean Steve and I, Steve and I. When we wrote the original business plan for the Macintosh division, as I said, at that executive committee where they were supposed to give us funding and declare us a division, that business plan had a marketing breakdown. And I had come from academia relatively recently, right? This was my first real job. And so my brain was in academia. I just wanted to make sure this could be used in academia and that students could use it, professors could use it, So I put in there this educational market, not the educational market that Apple was already good at, because K through 12, Apple owned that and owned that for a long time with the Apple II, but the higher education market. And so that was very important to me. So I shoved it in there as, one of the markets that we would approach. The other thing was international, because most of the computers that I had used and I had seen had forced everybody else to conform to not only the language, but all the nuances that go with the language, right? You don't have your currency in the computer years. And by the way, I have to again give credit where credit is due. The people who had started thinking about this profoundly and making it ground up international were the people on the Xerox Star. And Becker was the name of the gentleman who was fundamental in making all of this a reality. And so I was very inspired by what he had done on the Star. And of course, theirs was so comprehensive, and the Star was a very expensive product when it shipped, and so on. We had to figure out on the Macintosh how to do at least a fraction of that in a very clever and compact way that would fit into this tiny machine, right? And I have to say that it was Bruce Horn who came up with a solution that ended up being a solution that was great for a much more general purpose solution that was also great for all apps writers in other domains, but it was very specifically useful for us in international because of the resource manager and the resource files where you could separate data from code. So then you were working on the data separately. You never needed to be a programmer to go and actually change the data portion of an application. Data portion being the text, the currency, all the, and also apply to any data actually, frankly. So.
And could you see that data in context, or was it in a separate basically a text file?
Yeah, no.
So you wouldn't see where you wouldn't see, say, the dialog box.
Well, you did. It was called a resource manager, and it had a user interface of its own. So you could see that, for example, if you had it in German, it would overflow the dialog box. So then you could modify the dialog box to fit it appropriately. Yeah, it was a pretty cool way of doing things. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about the Apple University Consortium and also bringing Daniel Lewin onto the team?
Ah, yes. Who is now your fearless leader.
That's right.
Yes. So in working on the higher education, I realized that sales is an area where I have, when I first came to be the marketing person on the Macintosh, I knew zero about marketing. Well, I knew less than zero about sales. So selling to the educational market and understanding how you go about that whole process was completely opaque to me. And so I knew that we could make a product that was great for that market, but I didn't know how you would get the feedback from them early on so that you could make it so that it's particularly suited to their needs. So I engaged this consultant who had sold into higher education, and she came up with this proposal that what the higher education is used to is coming together in consortia on working on, it's almost like standards committees, but it's universities deciding that they were going to cooperate toward a goal. And so we thought, oh, that's great. We should put together a Macintosh Consortium with some pioneering universities and colleges who could also give us feedback during the development process. And I was very concerned about the fact that we had been somewhat insular in the Macintosh division and hadn't really engaged sales yet. We weren't ready to engage sales because the products were not ready, and the product was absolutely not ready yet, and so. But in this particular case, it was very important to engage sales. And I had a very good relationship with the Lisa division, and I had talked to them quite a bit, and I had met Daniel, who was their sales liaison. And I thought, my God, you know, he's so great. I wonder if we could convince him to come to do this for us. And he would be pretty independent, and, you know. So I wooed him, and and he thought it would be a really great project, and so he took the risk and came, and he did all the charm offensive on the universities in trying to get them to participate, and Mike Boych did all the technical charm offensive. So they were able to put, Daniel and Mike were able to put together a group of universities that we worked with, and were able to have actually direct sales into those universities once the Macintosh ships. They were our first solid customers that bought in quantity. So that was very important. And the international market also, specifically France, but also some of the others, but because Jean-Louis Gasset in France, you know, could do anything. And so with his evangelizing into the French market, we were able to sell quite a few Macintoshes internationally and into the university market. So straight off the bat. So the international was delayed by 6 months because of the power supply. But once we started shipping, it was quite successful.
Could you talk about Steve Kapps's Alice game? Andy Hirschfeld writes that you were the best player of the game.
Well, you know, to show the graphics capabilities of the Macintosh, Kapps wrote, do you have Alice in the museum? I hope you do, yeah. First of all, it's gorgeous, right? But secondly, the fact that the computer was powerful enough, or through software you could make it powerful enough to actually move those pieces quite rapidly, was quite an achievement, and it showcased the Macintosh beautifully. And you know, I got really intrigued in how fast can it go. So I was playing Alice. It's a chess game. I was playing Alice for hours, and I just was, and it. I have to say, it was pretty fast. So I loved the game, and it was such a wonderful tension reliever because we were there sometimes, you know, around the clock, and so at some point at night, you know, I would go and start playing Alice, and it was just, whoo, you know, yeah, it was great, and it's Kapps's genius and his creativity. I mean, he's amazing.
He had to make the game harder for you specifically.
Right, because I was whizzing along. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned Barbara Kolkin. Could you talk about how many women were working on the Macintosh team? And
well, let's see. So, you know, I don't know the exact chronology, but pretty quickly, once we started growing the team, we brought in, of course, Barbara Kolkin, we brought in Debbie Coleman, we brought in Susan Barnes, and they started their own teams, and we had a really, and we were also working very closely with the people in Apple Marcom. And Apple Marcom were these brilliant women, you know, just too many to name. They were fantastic. Susan Kerr was the first one, I think, on the engineering team, if I'm not mistaken. So Susan was you know, there day and night, working hand in hand with on the user interface and on the graphics and everything with the engineering team. So I would say Susan had a huge influence on how the Macintosh turned out visually. And and you know, one of the things that is interesting is that when Steve decided that we're going to build our own factory, we went through several accomplished potential male leaders of that project that we brought in from distinguished American manufacturing establishments. And they just couldn't cut it. They couldn't do it. And one of the things you have to also understand is that somebody who is fantastic in a large corporation and is able to manage a setup or to hone a setup or to improve on a setup is a very different person from somebody who has to build it themselves, who has to build a factory from scratch. So we had a difficult time. Matt Carter was a man we brought in who was, he was one of us, so to speak. He was one of the people that was involved in it. And then when time came to actually make it a production facility, it was Debbie Coleman, who moved from being our essentially the CFO of the Macintosh division to running the factory. And Debbie kept saying, you know, I'm from a large Catholic family. I know how to manage projects like this. So, but an English major, yeah, and she did a great job. And when Debbie moved into manufacturing, Susan Barnes became our CFO. So, and then, you know, on the we were working with sales and with distribution, and in distribution we were working with Donna Dubinsky, who was constantly challenging us on our forecasts and our processes as well. So, outside of the Macintosh division, there was a whole host of women that supported the effort.
Given the climate today in Silicon Valley and the discussion about women, opportunities as well as roles, how would you kind of describe the climate for you and other women at the time working on the team?
Well, I suppose I feel very fortunate because I'm not currently in an organization, any organization in Silicon Valley, so I cannot speak to what's happening today. I am somewhat surprised and shocked by some of the reports. What I can tell you from my own experience, and I think we had a panel actually that Andy Cunningham put together. Speaking of people on the outside who supported us, Andy and Cunningham and Jane Anderson and the team at Regis McKenna, who were involved in bringing the Macintosh, having all the media relations and bringing the Macintosh into the market. Just a few months ago, Andy and I got together, the women that worked on the Macintosh, and to recount our experiences. And we all agreed that, you know, we worked as a team. We worked as a team with all of our other team members, with all the men. We never, I don't think, ever stopped to think, well, you know, I'm a woman, therefore, or they said this because I'm a woman. We were so much almost an extended family that I hesitate to say this because you can't make absolute statements. There's probably always an exception, but I didn't know of one, let's put it that way. I just never felt, and none of these other people also ever felt like they were singled out or treated any differently because they were women. There was a common cause. We were all involved in that common cause, and you know, as I said, we were very fortunate in that respect. So, and, you know, in retrospect, I give Steve Jobs a lot of credit for that, because he established the atmosphere of, as long as you're performing and doing what you're supposed to do, he didn't care what you were, who you were, what your gender was, what your sexual orientation was, how you chose to dress. None of it made any difference to him. So that set the tone, I suppose. I didn't know it was exceptional, but I suppose it was. You know, it was my first job, so I don't know how it was in Silicon Valley, in other parts of Silicon Valley at the time. All I can tell you is my own experience and the experience of my colleagues.
Thank you.
Could you talk a bit about working with the engineering team and people like Andy Hertzfeld and Bill Atkinson, Bruce Horn? What was that experience like?
Well, it was exhilarating. It was just exhilarating. I mean, I have to say that I think most of the people that we attracted to the Macintosh team, most of the developers that we attracted on the outside, who chose to take a risk with their own efforts and money, did it because of their admiration for Andy Hertzfeld, Bill Atkinson, Bruce Horn, all of these people that were just so brilliant and devoted. You know, they were willing to sacrifice their lives to make this a reality. And the creativity was just astounding. To some extent, you know, they were so creative and so productive that we had a very hard time shipping the product, because till the very last minute they were putting in new things, more exciting features, and, you know, more surprises and fun things, you know. So this exuberance, this overflowing of imagination, creativity, devotion, was so compelling that we managed to create an industry out of thin air. You know, so, no, it was very exciting working with them. And you know, anytime we would recruit, we would have to have them go and meet the engineering team, because the engineering team was the magnet. They were the galvanizing force. So it was exciting. It was great. I mean, what can I say? It was just a wonderful, wonderful group of people.
Could you talk about meeting your husband and what was his role?
So I met Alan because Barbara and I decided we needed to recruit more marketing people. And we decided to that it was time perhaps to look at some MBAs, you know. And we got the book of graduating MBAs from Stanford and started going through various resumes. And both Barbara and I agreed on a few profiles. We wanted people with a very strong technical background. So there were a number of people who had come from the elite of the elite of the international engineering schools. And so we were looking at some of them. So Alain came from Polytechnique, and we saw his resume. There were several others who had come from Polytechnique. So, and I was interested very much in getting somebody who could work on international. So he was definitely. And then Bud Colligan was also in that same class, and we also wanted somebody who could work on product and education and so on. So Bud was very attractive from that point of view. So so we brought in those two people and about 4 or 5 others. So the 4 or 5 others thought we were too amateurish for their liking. They wanted to go and do serious things. So some of them went into the telecoms business. Others went to HP. But they turned us down eventually. We decided to make an offer to, I think, 4 people, if I'm not mistaken, after they had talked to our engineering team and so on. And 2 of the 4 people turned us down and never forgave themselves, by the way. And Alain was, when he met the engineering team, it was love at first sight. They loved him. He had programmed his own, had built kits and programmed and so on, and knew the Apple II inside out. And, so the engineers loved him. They really liked Bud because of his incredible enthusiasm. Bud was just enchanted by everything, and he just really wanted to work with us. So we hired the 2 of them. I think there were a couple others that were hired by others. I think the Debbie Coleman, I think, hired a couple people too. But anyway, so Alain started working on international at first. But then what happened is that because he was so technical and was able to really concisely not only explain to third parties what they needed to work on, but actually co-design products with them. The engineering team and the evangelism team, Guy Kawasaki, said, can we take him into our group, please, because we need his talent. So he went after working on international for less than 6 months, I think. He was recruited by Guy Kawasaki because Mike Boych at that time started working on a terminal emulator for the Macintosh with Martin Haberle, because it was deemed that it was important for the business market that we have a terminal emulator on the Macintosh. So Mike Boych and Martin were working on something else. And so Guy Kawasaki recruited Alain to work on evangelism, and more than evangelism, it was really co-designing products with the third parties. And you probably have that issue of, I think it was in Macworld, when Alain left the team to join Radius. There was a big ad that said, "Thank you, Alain, seriously." Because of all the developers signed it. So yeah, that's how we met. We were working on the Macintosh, and then what happened is that when Radius started with Burl Smith, and we haven't talked about Burl, who was in his own right just so creative and so brilliant in working in creating the hardware from his head, that when much later when Mike Boych and Burl Smith left to start Radius, they recruited Alain to go join Radius. And so we didn't actually get involved. We were good friends, but we didn't actually get involved more intimately until he had left Apple, I had left Apple, and then sort of fate brought us together. So I, it's kind of a funny funny development. But.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about evangelism. Could you maybe go more into that? And Mike Boych and Guy Kawasaki sort of starting that whole effort, and how important was that? Working with third-party developers.
Well, it was extremely important because if you think about the applications that made Macintosh take off, they were all done by third parties, right? And especially in the market of creative professionals, which was the PageMaker, was done by a third party. Adobe software for the Macintosh, and the laser writer was done by third party, and all the suite of software by Microsoft. And while Microsoft was working on theirs, Randy Wigington did some of our software, but as a third party developer, not inside the team. He was working on it independently. So FileMaker, I mean, the list goes on, and almost everything was done outside, and it was from the very start that these people were approached, and we're working with our evangelists. The evangelists got them in, and they worked with them on making them progress on their products. And to be able to ship so quickly after we had shipped, it was very, very impressive. Because we had worked with them hand in glove, the evangelism team and tech support. And
well, who came up with the term evangelism? Like, because that
may have been Guy Kawasaki. You should ask him, because I think it may have been Guy. Because Guy is really good at coining these phrases. I think it may have been Guy that coined the phrase. But everybody had a weird title, right? And he was a software wizard, and everyone had very quirky titles, and so I think Guy may have decided that that's what he wanted to name himself. So.
What was your title?
I didn't have a title for the longest time, but then I had to have a serious title because I was working with International, and they weren't quite as hip. So I had something like product marketing or manager product marketing or something like that. Mine was not so quirky. I didn't want a title for the longest time, but then I realized, wait a second, I know nothing about the business world. I have to establish credibility. I better do what is most efficacious.
What was your role for the rollout of the launch of the Macintosh?
I was responsible primarily for the international. I was on the team that rolled it out across the United States, and then I was working with all the international groups to do the rollouts in their countries. And so that was, but the product introduction plan, the PIP, that Barbara Colkin was, she had the whip and was like a figurative whip. She held everybody's feet to the fire. We were all, Barbara and I and Mike Murray were intimately involved in, step-by-step planning of all of that. Domestically and internationally, it was primarily me with the third-party managers. Not third-party, sorry, excuse me, with the international country managers trying to do the intro. And then when the first intro happened here, I was supposed to be abroad. I was supposed to be doing it in Australia, actually.
Oh, you mean when Steve...
And Steve said, under no circumstances are you going anywhere. You're going to be here with us, with your family, for this momentous event. You're staying here. So I felt guilty, but I had to call Australia and say, I'm not coming. You guys are on your own. So And he was right. Steve was right. It was, the most incredible moment in my life, and not to be there with Andy and Susan and Barbara and Steve and of course Steve and everybody else would have been just traumatizing, I think, in retrospect. But I was so determined at the time that, I have a mission. I have to make it successful abroad. I hadn't thought about my own personal loss if I hadn't been there. So, yeah. So, once again, Steve was right.
So you then transferred back from international back to the main U.S. marketing in '85.
Right.
Could you talk about why you made that decision?
It wasn't really my decision. The marketing team and Steve came to me and said, "Well, we need somebody who can continue working with engineering really closely, and you have a proven track record. You have to do this." So I thought, okay, I'll do it. At the time, also there was the effort for the Turbo Mac, which was supposed to be the Macintosh with a built-in hard disk, and it was a tough time for Apple, and a tough time for the Macintosh division specifically. There was a big letdown after this kind of whoosh after the Macintosh shipped, and it was really hard to harness the same energy again to work on maintenance and to work on new releases and so on. It was just very, very tough. And to work on this new effort, which would require a major engineering effort to do the Turbo Mac. So we separated it into its own part of a building, and I had two offices, one in the main Macintosh building and one in the Turbo Mac group, to get people to mobilize and have the same level of enthusiasm for this product as they did for the Macintosh. But it was really tough because people had been sprinting a marathon until, and then all of a sudden to have that whoosh afterwards, and then regain the momentum to continue working on it was not that easy. And so that's why I came in to do that.
How did the team change, the Mac team change after the launch? Were there?
Well, we had a few people leave. Some people just simply decided to take some left, some took a break, and so it was not the same team anymore. So, yeah, it was harder to get it all together.
So, we're talking about the Mac being in trouble in 1985. Why did the Mac not sell initially?
Well, all the limitations that we had built into it came back to haunt us, right? The limited memory, the limited screen size, the performance was. Some of the applications were way too ambitious for the oomph, so that we had built in. So it was important to keep iterating in response to the market, and we just weren't quite as fast in doing that. So the initial Mac was, and I mean, think about this for a minute. This is a product that was sold essentially without a printer. It had, the only thing it had was a dot matrix printer, because we wanted WYSIWYG, and you couldn't do that with that letter quality printer, which was essentially a modified typewriter, right? You couldn't do that. So, so despite all those limitations, it still sold quite a bit. It's just that our forecasts had been unrealistic. So it's the expectation versus the reality that that was haunting us at the time.
And you were responsible for reporting that forecast, right?
Right.
How difficult was that?
It was, at the first forecasting meeting I walked into, I realized that the domestic forecasts hadn't changed since we had shipped. They still were these crazy, unrealistic forecasts. So I had to just slash them, which was a major relief to our sales and distribution group. But of course, it was not well received by anybody else. But you know, you can't fight reality. It was in our faces that we weren't selling as many as we had predicted, and yet we were still pretending like this was going to be happening any minute now. The forecast next month will be this gargantuan forecast. So yeah, so we had to slash it. I had to slash it. I think Donna may remember that actually, because I think it was a major relief to them.
Right.
How big was the gap?
You know, I don't remember now, because since then so many numbers have been floated around, but it was significant. It was more than 50%.
Did you work on the Mac Office campaign, the Macintosh Office campaign with Barbara?
Yes, I did. I was involved in the rollout and again the product introduction plans and so on. But I was working on the Macintosh specifically at that point, and the ill-fated Macintosh XL, which was essentially renamed Lisa, which was that's one of the reasons I left Apple, frankly speaking. And so I was working on those two products specifically as part of the Macintosh Office offering, so trying to make sure that the Macintosh and the Lisa had the same, had at least some of the kernels of what it took to approach the Office market. Yeah. But actually, it was the laser writer that made that whole thing take off. The contributor to the Office market, but not Office market in the classical sense, but the creative knowledge workers, we used to call them, the term I didn't like. But at any rate, it turned out there are quite a few creative people who really needed the tools, and we were able to provide them the tools with the laser writer, PageMaker, the Adobe Suite eventually, and so on.
So desktop publishing.
Desktop publishing, that was it, yeah.
So in your view, was that what saved the Macintosh?
Oh yeah, absolutely, no question. Yep, that was it.
You mentioned the Mac XL.
And Bloomberg was involved in that.
Bruce Bloomberg?
Yeah, Bruce Bloomberg was the product manager for the laser writer and the desktop publishing market.
You mentioned the Mac XL. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So, you know, at some point, the Lisa was not, obviously, was not succeeding. And frankly speaking, I don't know exactly the details of why things didn't quite work out, except that it was ultra expensive. Well, ultra. It was $10,000, but it was expensive, right? Compared to the nearest competition, which was the IBM PC, which was significantly cheaper. Anyway, or even the Apple II with the suite of VisiCalc software and then Lotus software eventually. Lotus software on the IBM PC. Anyway, so it wasn't selling. And meanwhile, we had the Macintosh users clamoring for bigger screen and more memory. And we thought, okay, I wasn't involved in the decision. Somebody thought that after we merged, by the way, we merged the two divisions We had their product managers as well as ours working together, their international and our international working together. So we combined the teams. And we had attrition, of course, as always happens in such cases. But in any case, there was this decision before I took over that we should label have an emulation mode on the Lisa. It could emulate the Macintosh, and call it the Macintosh XL. Extra large, I guess. Well, the problem was that it was a bit of a farce in that when you emulated the Macintosh, it wasn't full emulation. Only a certain percentage of applications could run. It was not really, the two operating systems were not, you know, it was slower because it was built on top of the Lisa, what was already built into it, right? However, the pent-up demand in the market was such that when I came onto the project, it had just been announced, and I told them that this is going to sell out in 3 months, and then we are in deep doo-doo. Because having a 3-month product that we had no intention of supporting into the future was going to cause a major dissatisfaction in the marketplace. The forecast that were presented based on the Lisa's previous sales was that it would take 18 months and it will slowly dwindle and it would just, you know, peter out into the sunset with nobody noticing. Well, guess what? We sold out in less than 3 months. We had no intention of building more, and it was a major scandal, except that it was overshadowed by a different scandal, Steve being kicked out of Apple. So nobody noticed the XL fiasco. But I felt like I was put in a position to lie to the customers, and I just didn't like that. And so I went on a leave of absence, and then eventually I decided not to go back. But with Steve gone and with various things happening at Apple, it wasn't my Apple anymore. But that was, I tell you, that it would have been a public relations, a total disaster if it hadn't been for bigger news. But there was clearly demand, right? There was clearly demand for a bigger Macintosh with a larger screen, with a built-in hard disk, you know. So it happened eventually. It took a while.
But who was buying that? Was that business customers?
Businesses were buying it, yeah. Even with the dot matrix printer. Can you imagine?
But the TurboMac that you said was also supposed to be addressing those needs as well.
Yeah, but it wasn't there yet. It took a while for it to, we just couldn't get people motivated to really work on it. Burl Smith was working on the hardware. He just went and, you know, Burlism was like he was able to just focus and just get it done. Burl was doing it, but we couldn't get the software people to be there to work on it, to work on the file system, and you know, all the other software that needed to, all the other firmware and system software that needed to be there to make it work. So it was a challenge.
And could you talk about, you know, the Steve leaving and that whole situation?
Well, so apparently there were all these palace intrigues that were going on that I wasn't really privy to. I was too busy trying to figure out how we're going to salvage the situation. And the one thing I did notice is that Steve was not as involved in the Macintosh, and that was hurting us. And so I kept trying to get him back and focusing on the Mac. But of course, being unaware of the fact that, you know, that there were all these big forces going on behind the scenes, I had a grudge against him. I thought, what the hell is he doing? Why isn't he focusing on the Mac? He needs to be here, he needs to be motivating the people, he needs to be presenting the vision for the next generation and what we're going to do to maintain it and all of that. And he was his heart wasn't in it, and that's because he was having these battles at the executive level, which as I said, I wasn't privy to. And then I found out. I only found out after he left, because then, of course, he was profoundly depressed, and we talked a lot about that. So.
So then you leave, and at what point did you decide to join Next? Did you take time off in between?
I did take a little, yes, I took some time off, and then Steve started Next, and he had told me about Next and everything that was going to happen. And I didn't join Next actually as an employee, I don't think. I don't remember now. I think I was a contractor, if I'm not mistaken. Because I wasn't feeling 100%. I was kind of depressed myself at the time. And also, I was marveling at Steve, after everything he had been through, being able to pick up and run again and get all excited in the new technology and everything else. But I also felt a little bit like that the vision of that original Next, eventually, of course, it was an incredible thing that saved Apple, but that original Next, that vision was not big enough for Steve. It was a very constrained vision, based on where the Macintosh was successful, which was the education market, right? So Mac is successful in that market. Let's build a machine that's tailored to that market, right? But it didn't have the scope of Steve's potential, right? Steve changes the world. He doesn't focus on little market that he's going to cater to. So I felt a little bit ambivalent from the very beginning. And then it turned out that I had an autoimmune disease. I had a thyroid problem that needed attention. And so after 9 months at Next, I left. And I have to be honest, I think I felt a little bit jaded. Like, Steve, not again. 18 months, we're going to have this incredible product, and it's going to do this and that and 20 other things, and not again with focusing on an unrealistic storage device and so on. So I was kind of feeling like, I don't think I have the energy for this. A new group of people needs to get in here and be all gung-ho. So, yeah. But, and obviously they got in there, they were gung-ho, and they created a wonderful operating system and so on. Despite all the trials and tribulations that Next went through, their end product software was amazing, right? And so, that was great. But it was a long road. I just didn't have the stamina for that road. Not at that time, anyway.
Well, a lot of your friends who had been on the Mac were among the co-founders, right? So Susan Barnes, Bud Tribble, Daniel.
Right.
What was sort of the atmosphere like there? Working with all your friends.
That part was really wonderful and fun, but in the first 9 months there was a bit of a disorientation, right? So exactly what are we going to do, how we're going to start, what are we going to focus on. There was the 3M machine, and we were going to various colleges and asking them what they want to do, and with their computers, and what would they like in their computing device, how much they were willing to pay. So there was a lot of exploratory work going on. So that was interesting, but again, I felt like you can't ask people what they want today, given that it's gonna take a few years for you to produce this product, even if they are focused on what they need right now, right? Even academics and even futurists are not going to say, hey, in 5 years, I think I'll need this, or in 3 years, I think I'll need that. They focus on what they want now. And I could see that when I was, present in these interviews, that they were all enthusiastic about something that they could have tomorrow or in 3 months, not something that they could have in 3 years. And that's why I thought this is not something that Steve had ever done before. Do a product based on market research. You hone a product based on market research. You don't invent a revolutionary offering based on people's limited imagination at the moment, right? So that's why I'm also saying that it didn't live up to Steve's potential. He had much grander capacity to shape the future than talking to academics to see what they wanted tomorrow for their computer lab, So, mismatch.
Yeah. I'm wondering if, was that focus on higher education partly due to, there was a non-compete agreement signed with Apple that because of the fact that so many of the founders had been on the Macintosh team, so there was a lawsuit, right? And so there was the idea that Next couldn't compete directly with Apple.
You know what? I don't remember. Because I wasn't really, none of that interested me, to be honest with you, so I don't know exactly what the details of that were. And since I wasn't there at the very beginning of Next, it was a few months later that I joined, I think they had ironed all that out somehow, or they had come to some kind of an agreement before I got there. So I don't really know exactly. What I can say is that I think the model was, where is there a market ripe for picking for this new technology? Well, look at that. They bought into the Macintosh in the very early stages. So let's talk to them and see what they want as their next great thing, So I think that was the primary motivation.
Right. Mm-hmm. So what was your role specifically there?
So ironically, my role was supposed to be product marketing, like on the Macintosh, except that they had an immediate issue at hand, which was that for some reason they had bought software that was written for the Macintosh, a word processing software, MacAuthor. Is that MacAuthor or? Geez, I'm so terrible with remembering. But anyway.
Right now?
Right now. That's
was
it.
That? Oh, yeah.
Right now. Fantastic.
It was a great program.
It was a fantastic program. It was just really brilliant. It was a great word processor for the Macintosh. Next had bought it. So the question is, what do you do with it? Okay, you can have them port it to the Next, but the Next didn't have yet anything to port it onto. And what do we do with the Macintosh version, meanwhile? So this was my immediate concern, is what do we do with this product that we have? And we're not going to go into the Macintosh dealer business or selling the Macintosh software business. So what do we do with it? So, of course, I thought of Heidi Roizen. I thought, she knows how to do this. She knows how to sell these products. Let's sell it to Heidi. And so she and I got together. This would be a really good product for your offering, the tea maker. And Heidi agreed, and they bought Right Now. And meanwhile, the team that was there was supposed to be importing it. I don't know what happened with that because I left by that time. So, so I don't know if it ever had an incarnation on the next machine or not. But the Macintosh version was sold. So that was my immediate project, and as soon as I had completed it, I decided to take off to try and deal with my health issue. So.
I think you're on a video of a retreat that Next had, talking about the unrealistic release schedule. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, because, you know, as I was telling you, it was just, maybe I was too jaded at that point, but I thought, come on, we've done this before. We had this crazy schedule, and it really damaged not only people's psyches, but it also damaged the product concept itself, because by the time we shipped it, some of it was already obsolete because we thought we would ship it in 18 months, and then it was 24 months with the Macintosh. So let's not do that again on the next machine. So that's what was my primary concern, is that, come on, let's be just a little bit more realistic this time. But, you know, to Steve's credit, the fact that he can, you know, like a phoenix, rising up out of ashes and all of a sudden going gung-ho with the same enthusiasm. In 18 months, we're going to do this amazing new product. And it's, you know, and guess what? He did attract some really great people to do it again, as I said. So, but I was just not... I was not getting into the groove, so to speak. So yes, yeah, I think I irritated Steve at that point. Like, you know, what's wrong with you? Why can't you muster the enthusiasm again? I blamed it on my thyroid.
You had said earlier that Steve was very depressed. You were talking to him in that period when he left Apple, but was Next clearly was a way that brought him out of that.
Right.
So do you think that, or talk about that relationship between, you know, having that energy, it was in some way therapeutic for him to throw himself into that?
Yeah, I think, you know, Steve was just, had been involved with creating something, being part of a creative process since he was very, very young. And I think he was having withdrawal symptoms, frankly speaking, from not being in the crucible of creating something new and something exciting. So he was able to focus enough to be able to say, okay, I'm going to do the next thing. And that was, yes, it was certainly therapeutic, but it was such a, I think, such a blow to Steve. The whole Apple ouster was really emotionally very, very difficult for him, not only because he was parted from his creation, but because he had some profound relationships with the people who did it, who'd ousted him. So it was, you know, there were multiple blows there. But to his credit, he was able to come up with something else to start harnessing his energies. And it was a ramp, I think. That's why when I was at Next, I saw only the beginning of that ramp, but it eventually, you know, grew into something much bigger than that an original mission.
Mm-hmm. So what was that original mission statement when, at the time that you were there, and how did that change over time over
Well,
the
the
years?
original mission statement was that they were going to create the 3M machine, right, for the educational market, based on an advanced operating system. So it was going to be Unix-based, some flavor of Unix. And it was going to have state-of-the-art development tools based on some language, which they decided to be Objective-C eventually. And it it didn't take very long for that part to gel. So that was, and it was going to be in an amazing, unbelievable case. It was going to be the most beautiful machine ever created, and it was gorgeous. No question about that. So,
was networking part of that plan?
yes, networking was part of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As consciously more networking than the Mac?
Yes, because, well, it depends what you mean by...
I mean, they recognized that the networking had not been a big part of the Mac, at least early on.
But we eventually, the Apple Talk eventually became part of the Mac. Well, not even eventually. It actually...
True, by the laser writer time.
Yeah, by the laser writer time, it was part of the... from that experience, and the industry had moved on. So yes, networking was very much part of it.
But was it the universities that you had gone to for doing that market research were telling you that they wanted Unix and they wanted TCP/IP and all those things?
I think that was actually from the very beginning, but the universities confirmed it. They definitely confirmed it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess that'd be my question. With Unix, TCP/IP kind of comes as part of the package,
right.
But was there more of an interest in it than that, seeing it as a really important connectivity as an important
It was,
part
by that time, I think it was seen as important because we were all relying so much on email and so at Apple we had been relying on communicating with each other and so on. And part of the Apple Office concept was supposed to be the not only the laser writer as being a shared resource, a networked product, but also the fact that that we're working on a file server, which never materialized, of course, but the concepts were already there. So the networking was already being thought of as something that was very important. Now, of course, it wasn't. It was Ethernet inside inter networking, not intra networking, but or vice versa. Did I just do the wrong gesture?
Ethernet intra,
yeah.
Inter outer.
Out, yeah. But that came later. Yeah.
Looking back on sort of next trajectory, shipping in 88, 89, and then eventually killing off the hardware, becoming a software company, and then getting acquired by Apple. What was your sort of view on all that, looking from the outside?
I don't know that I had any particular view. I knew that somehow Steve would salvage this effort. I knew that the effort was worthwhile. And so I had faith in Steve that somehow he was going to manage to make it successful. When he went back to Apple, oh my God, I think I wasn't the only one, but I think many of us thought, okay, this is Apple's rebirth. This is Apple's renaissance. Yeah, because couldn't go much lower at that point. Apple, right, had just degenerated so profoundly that the next step would have been to close shop. So, so Steve was always good at resurrecting things out of ashes, right? I mean, Pixar was there was no future for Pixar when Steve came in and was able to give so much of fuel for it to continue at huge risk to himself. I mean, he invested most of his net worth, I think, a substantial portion of his net worth into Pixar. I mean, who does that, right? Only someone who doesn't care about his net worth, and is so convinced that what he sees, the potential that he sees, is going to be realized. So, I think we thought this is going to breathe a new life into Apple. Now, how? Nobody knew exactly how he would do that. But the Macintoshes changed immediately, right? They all of a sudden started having personalities again. They started to having that magnetism. They started attracting attention and customers, and that was amazing. And of course, the Next software, God bless them. I mean, it revived the Macintosh. I kept saying that the first Macintosh's success was really Windows, right? But I don't want people to misunderstand. The Macintosh that is today's Macintosh and really gained market share and is the success that it is, the definition of the Macintosh today is very different from the Macintosh that we shipped, right? It was Next software that created that Macintosh, to the exclusion of the previous Macintosh. People don't remember the previous Macintosh. So I don't want there to be a misunderstanding, because I think the last time I spoke to you, I said that the real success in terms of market acceptance was really in Windows, because Windows was essentially a copy of the Macintosh and took over the world. But today's Macintosh success is Next. No question.
How much time did you take off after leaving Next to focus on your health?
I don't remember, because I got involved in a bunch of little startups that were doing things for the Macintosh. And I can't tell you exactly how long that lasted. I have such a tough time with chronology. So I don't know, but it was a few months, and then I got involved in a whole bunch of other things, and got involved with Hartmut Esslinger on Frogs with Andy Hertzfeld. Got involved with Lucid, which was doing Common Lisp. And, because I was all excited that AI software was going to finally take off. As I said, I'm the queen of failures. I don't know whether it's I jinx things or whether it's just that I'm attracted to the bleeding edge at a time when there is not yet the prerequisite set of ingredients to make it successful. But that's what makes it really fun, right? Is to be there at the very edge of what's possible. So, I worked there, and then eventually I joined the General Magic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how did you come to join General Magic? Obviously, you knew many of the people.
Yes, I joined General Magic because Andy Hertzfeld and Bill Atkinson were the co-founders, and when they started thinking about marketing, they told Marc that they know me and they would like me to join. And so I met Marc, and of course Marc's vision was unbelievable, right? His famous book. You guys should have a copy of that book. Do you have a copy of that book?
We don't, but it's going to be a part of our request.
Oh yeah, you have to have a copy of that book, because it's incredible. The book is incredible. the book essentially talked about a personal digital assistant, something that you would have with you all the time, something that was essentially your amanuensis in the sense that, you know, it helped you research things, it helped you buy things, it helped you. I don't want to recreate Marc's vision here because he had highways, destinations, and the 3 circles overlapping. You know, it was just this grand seductive vision that, you know, once you saw it, you couldn't help but think, okay, sign me on, you know. But not only was it supposed to be a personal digital assistant, but incarnations of it, he imagined, and communication was a huge part of it. It was, you know, communicate, buy, and research, essentially, information, communication, and he called it highways, destinations, and something else. You know, I'm drawing a blank, I'm sorry. But so it was supposed to be able to communicate, it was supposed to be able to, you were supposed to be able to buy on it, you were supposed to be able to do all kinds of research. And not only that, but in this book, he had a picture, several pictures of something that looked very much like an iPhone, a smartphone, with various attachments for medical applications, for meteorological applications, for, you know, market-specific niche applications and vertical applications. So it was just incredible in its scope. The scope was phenomenal. So, you know, it was a no-brainer for me to join, and especially since I knew Bill and Andy, and I knew that you know, I loved working with them. And it was a fantastic team. We were able to attract the most amazing group of people. You know, when you start thinking about people in this valley, Tony Fidel, Andy Rubin, Steve Perlman, you know, the list goes on and on. Megan Smith, the CTO of the United States, was a part of our team. And Lee Migdal. It was just really an amazing group of people. So they were the next generation. They were the ones that, despite the fact that General Magic failed, they took on the mantle of the vision, and they went on into this valley, into Apple and Google and Facebook and, you know, various other places, Amazon, and recreated it. How could I forget? Amazon. Amazon was started at General Magic because we said to him that we weren't interested. He came to us. He came to General Magic and said, you know, we are Pierre Mediar said, you know, I'm thinking of doing this. Is General Magic interested? Because I was working on it while I was here, but not on your time, but on my time. But I wanted to, out of courtesy, let you guys invest. And we said, oh, no, we'll sign the paper. It's all yours. Go, with our blessing, go forth and multiply. And he did. Well,
tell me more about.
Huh?
Tell me more about that. So that.
Well, you know, it started with Pez dispensers, right?
Right.
Piero Mediar was actually working in my group. Just before I left, we hired him.
eBay.
eBay. Oh, did I say Amazon?
You said Amazon.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No.
That was a mistake.
I was thinking, wow, I didn't know that.
No.
Yeah,
eBay. Yeah.
So tell me more. So he was selling the Pez dispensers.
Yeah, he was doing the Pez dispensers, and he was his girlfriend at the time, I think, his current wife, if I'm not mistaken, was collecting Pez dispensers, and they were trying to create a site that would allow collectors and to exchange information and to exchange product info and so on and find each other. Oops, sorry. And so that's how eBay got started. Yeah, I really apologize. I meant eBay. Yeah.
We were really amazed. We were leaning in. This is new history.
No.
What a scoop.
No. Yeah. Sorry.
eBay is an
No, but
amazing
that's still,
story.
I
It's
didn't
very
actually know
important.
that either. So
No, that's it. Yeah, no. Pierre started while he was at General Magic, and you know, so an amazing group of people. Darren Adler, who went back to Apple to work on the new incarnations of the Macintosh after the next merger. I mean, I can't even name everybody, you know. So.
now you knew about the Dynabook presumably from earlier.
Oh yeah,
on.
of course.
And I mean, obviously this came out of the milieu of the Knowledge Navigator and all that.
Right.
But I mean, how much did the vision make you think, for instance, of some of the things at PARC around the wilder visions for the Dynabook?
You know, the communications part of this was really critical and much better defined in terms of exactly what it could and couldn't do. And the Dynabook was really more of a computer that was with you all the time. The DNA of Dynabook came from computing, and the DNA of what General Magic was trying to do actually came from communications. So I think that would have been the biggest distinction, because the focus really was on email first and foremost, and then secondly on being able to purchase things and work together, collaborate, but having all your information with you at all times. So.
And how about the Jeff Raskin's Mac concept? There's also, did it remind you at all of that, the communication aspect?
And not really. This was, I mean, that's why I say you really need to look at the book, because its center of gravity is very different from anything that came before. And that's why, by the way, John Scully decided to launch the Newton project, which where he used a lot of the language of Marc Perrat's communication-centered vision, except that because communication wasn't there quite yet, they focused more on a PDA facet of it. But it was essentially one of those things that eventually this was going to be your email machine.
So that's why they gave it names that sounded more communication-oriented.
Yeah.
And the original plan was to build a proprietary network, or, I mean,
well, that was. I mean, there were many missteps, and that was definitely one of them. You know, the analysis of what happened with General Magic is rather profound and a little bit multifaceted, shall we say. General Magic's model was to have multiple licensees. So we were going to create the core software and hardware and communications software and hardware prototype, and we were going to license it to many people. Now, what happened is that the licensees were also the investors. The licensees were on the board. So when you don't have any VCs, right, and you have your customers on your board, your customers' interests are that you stay alive enough to supply them with what they need, but they don't want you to become terribly successful or powerful or succeed in your own right. And even if they did, there is an underlying motive there where they have to care for their interests first, right? So that model was flawed. Number one. Number two, the technology, the communications technology simply wasn't there. The wireless was not there yet. there was no wireless infrastructure that we could plug into. So the Sony product, you had to plug into a wall and essentially use a modem to be able to communicate, which was still, okay, not terrible, because you could line up all your emails and so on and plug in, which is what people were doing with their computers, right? But with a portable device that you carry around with you all the time and everything, right, that was not ideal. So the infrastructure wasn't there yet, and that's why we went with AT&T, because we thought that they could build out part of the infrastructure, and with Motorola, which could give us the wireless. Well, you know, a small company cannot get these behemoths to work together and create something. And also we had a flawed model of what that infrastructure could be, because we should have understood the internet and said this is going to be the infrastructure. Instead, once we decided to go with AT&T, then we had to commit to it being proprietary, and that was a big mistake, of course. And you have to consider the fact that although all of these companies really bought into the vision, it was not at the core of any of their businesses. And so therefore, except for Sony, which was so keen, and they were just the most wonderful partner, I can't say enough good things about Sony. Except for Sony, all the others had assigned the B or the C team in their companies, right? We're talking about the leading edge of technology, where you have to have like the most creative minds coming up with breakthroughs almost every day. And when your partners have not made that commitment, it's very difficult to drag them along, right? So that was also a problem. So there were many issues. We were trying to do too much, too many partners, proprietary, not seeing the internet in time to be able to latch onto the internet. Now, I was trying to do something which was, I was working with AOL to get the AOL communication structure working on our software. And my thinking was, AT&T, no AT&T, whatever, if we have at least AOL, we are eventually going to graduate with AOL, even if we don't do anything else, right? We're going to go with them. And they were wonderful. They actually decided to take the risk, and they were working on it. And of course, you know, that did not appeal to some of our licensees. But we had way too many. I mean, we had Philips, AT&T, Sony, Panasonic, IBM. I mean, one of those giant partners, again, I put Sony in a category by itself because they were absolutely amazing. One of those other partners is enough to kill a startup. Having them all together, being your customers, was just, you know, a death. And
they had their own sort of board within the, what was it called? You had
they had the
Founding Partners Council.
Council, yeah.
So that was that effective or very slow moving, or?
Well, you know, that was the board of directors, essentially, the Founding Partners Council, and that included all the licensees, AT&T and Motorola, and so it was a pretty large group, as I recall. But again, you couldn't discuss anything in those meetings because everything was proprietary to each group. They were competitors. So how are you going to get them to provide any kind of guidance, governance or management guidance, when you can't discuss anything that is specific, right? So that was also problematic. And I recall When I say Sony, I mean Sony Japan. I recall that one of the guys, I don't remember whether it was Sony America or if it was somebody from AT&T or whatever, when Marc talked to him about the book and what we should start with, what is, where should we concentrate, right? I kept saying, you know, that maxim that that startups die of indigestion and not starvation, that was true in spades for General Magic, and we needed to focus. We needed to pare down. We needed to make it less ambitious and less ambitious. And so I had urged Marc to talk to the board and some of the licensees in private and ask them, you know, what would be the most compelling product for you? And believe it or not, one of them, I don't recall now who it was, said, do them all. Clearly, they had no experience with startups. They had no idea. They had divisions competing with each other and everything. They did not grok the fact that we have to focus and you have to make choices and you have to make decisions and so on. So anyway, so those were all issues.
In retrospect, 2020 gives hindsight has a more like a 2020 vision. At the time when you have these, you know, hard decisions, what was the decision? What was the dynamic among the leadership for Keystart? You have so many brilliant people with a big vision, and yet the execution was lagging. What kinds of ways did you address those kind of difficult decisions?
Well, actually, in the end, we sort of punted, I think, which is one of the reasons why the products, the Motorola product and the Sony products, when they came out, you know, were rather cumbersome and difficult to use and slow, because some of these really hard decisions, we didn't make them. We just put too much into the product. We made it too cumbersome. Couldn't really pare it down. And so, and the infrastructure that we were expecting any time now, Motorola was going to announce a wireless network and so on. It didn't happen in time, so we couldn't quite.
And you were VP of marketing there. What were the main business and marketing strategies? What were you selling as, what were you using as the main selling points for Magic?
The main selling points were that it's portable, which it turned out to be less portable than we had liked because it was pretty. It was not that form factor. Excuse me. It was not that form factor. This is a technology that's with you all the time. It has all your information at all times, and it helps you communicate. Email, you know, and rich content. Email, not just text, but having other content in your email. So those were the main selling points.
So news was not part of it, particularly reading the newspaper. How about navigating information like AOL or, you know, looking up things?
No,
okay.
not at the time. No, we didn't have that. You know, the thing is, well, that was the issue. You know, I was waiting for the AOL product, and once we had that, we could have had more things to. But we were selling the vision, the future. You know, in the future, it's going to be doing this and this and that. But at the present, we didn't have that.
And the AOL product would have been basically the AOL client running on the General Magic device.
Yeah, but with the user interface of the Magic app.
Right. And being able to do direct transactions, perhaps, or have your agent buy things for you.
Exactly.
That kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how did you in the marketing? How did you differentiate General Magic from the Newton?
Well, by that time, I think we didn't have to, because the Newton was not successful, and none of our partners even tried. to position themselves against the Newton or anything. The partners were in competition with Scully rather than with the Newton, frankly speaking. The partners wanted to all seem visionary like Scully did. When Scully issued that, when John Scully had that video of himself with the PDA vision, every one of our partners except Sony Japan, when I say everyone, always excludes Sony, they're saints. They were saints. Wanted to get that vision thing going. They all wanted their own videos, and they wanted to be able to go out there and announce right away. The product was at least a year from shipping, and they wanted to make a partnership announcement so they could all talk about the vision because that was critical to them. And that was my biggest fight, trying to hold them back, because I knew they had limited budgets, and I knew that if they blew their budgets on that announcement, they won't have much left for when the product actually ships. Sure enough, they blew it on their vision announcements and the big thing in New York and everything else, and by the time the product was in the market, very little marketing dollars remained to actually make a push.
Describe the big thing in New York.
We had this big announcement in New York of the partnership and the licensees, without actually giving out any details of each licensee's products, but with the vision. And they all got up there and talked about they're committed to making these products that are going to be communicating, and that they're going to be portable and always with you. They took each one took a piece of Marc's vision and elaborated on it as their vision of their company, which is fine, except that it all went from the budget that was committed to General Magic product shipment. And so by the time we shipped product, there was no money to train the dealers. There was no money to do any meaningful advertising. We were able to keep that buzz of that announcement going through PR in our group for a year, believe it or not. The things that kept coming out in the press over and over again and everything, we were able to maintain that. Somebody reminded me of that. Actually, Mike Stern reminded me of that recently, because there's a documentary being made on the whole General Magic journey, and so a lot of this has been rehashed now. People are remembering what actually happened and are looking at some of the artifacts from that period. And Mike was saying, "Oh my God, I'm looking at all the press, and you guys were able to keep it alive for over a year after the announcement." But, you needed more than that. When you have a channel, unless things sell themselves, you're not going to be able to sell it through Fry's without some investment in how it's going to be presented and how it's going to be talked about. And so.
Now, your husband was working for one of the main competitors at that time.
Yes, EO.
Yes. So how did that play out? And when you had obviously gotten involved somewhere between the Macintosh and then.
Yeah.
So you were literally both working for direct competitors, but within a community of people that knew each other very well. I mean, what was that like?
Well, it was interesting. We never talked about work. Now, and we were working with some of the same licensees, by the way. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of interesting, because we couldn't share any of that. Now, what helped is that a few months after I joined General Magic, it turned out I was pregnant. And so in that process, we had a child. So there was a lot to talk about without concentrating on work. So it was a bit tense, I have to say. And of course, my colleagues were sort of at General Magic were a little bit resentful, and his colleagues at EO were a little suspicious. But we somehow managed to get through that. I think people realized that we really didn't communicate at all about any of what was going on in our companies. And we were dead set on succeeding in our own right against the competitors. So.
But obviously you both were excited by a similar vision of portable, easy to use. I mean, did you talk in more general terms about, or did you just sort of avoided that whole area?
I remember like we had decided that any of that, all of that was totally taboo. And so and for a few years there, we just had no professional talk whatsoever. And we didn't talk about the licensees. We were sometimes itching to say, oh, and so, did you have this experience with, what did you tell him when, off limits, off limits. On the other hand, some of the licensees didn't have the same qualms. So they would tell them what we were doing, they would tell us what they were doing, but it didn't come through this channel, it came through
So you found out what your husband was doing through these very circuitous.
Right, and people would come and say to me, "Did you know?" And I'd say, "No, I didn't know." Well, how do you know? Well, one of our licensees told us.
Oh, that's funny. And the IPO was quite, it's an exciting period, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's when hopes were very
high.
Any recollections of that or stories?
Well, my group and I worked mostly with the analysts, so we were involved with the groups that were separate from the investment arms, and we were talking in broad terms about the market, the potential of the market, and so on. The actual IPO involved mainly Marc, because we were in the throes of actually producing the products. So he managed to insulate us from that effort so that we didn't have to participate so much. It was Marc Perret and Marco Demeras, and the licensees, but not even so many licensees, I think. It was mostly Marc and Marco and Mike Stern, who was the general counsel, doing all the prep work and working on it and so on. We edited the materials in our group, but we tried to insulate the engineering group and some of the product marketing and so on very intentionally from what was going on.
But in terms of excitement and feeling that you were moving
yes, there was, people, of course it gave people a boost because, again, it was another one of those efforts where everyone had thought that it would take a couple years and it was taking longer and it was more exasperating, so it gave an enormous morale boost at a time when everybody needed to regroup and continue, pushing forward.
And in the middle of all this, the web did start to get buzz.
Yeah, right.
So what was the attitude about?
I think wistful, actually, because at that point we really wanted to be able to take advantage of the web, but we were locked in. So,
a web browser never came up because it would have been. Yeah. No. Even when AOL moved that direction.
Well, no. We were hoping that AOL would move in that direction and that we would be able to. We wanted to, but it was just that we were constrained, contractually constrained. And the thing that I should mention is that very early on, we had a consultant, and I wish I could remember his name, he was a friend of Rich Miller's, who said, "Why don't you guys just use the internet and the World Wide Web, And the problem was that at the time it was ARPANET. Why not use the ARPANET? I think it was still ARPANET, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, the problem was that we had this model that somehow we have to have a partner that is a communications biggie. You know, with AT&T, we could also think in the future of phones, and so it was our problem. It was somehow we didn't see it. You know what I mean? We just didn't see it, even though we were told. We just would not grab onto that idea, which I wish we had, but obviously.
So you stayed until 1995.
Right.
Talk about what made you decide to leave.
Well, there were a number of things. I think I was just too exasperated, and at that point, I was becoming, I think, rather. How should I put it? Non-diplomatic with our partners, and I thought at that point that wait a second, this can't go on, because I was coming to heads, and I think Megan, in her infinite wisdom, and she's always wise, even beyond her years, because at the time she was a kid and I was supposed to be the adult. Megan told me once, you can't do this. You can't just insult them to their faces, And but I had it with them, and so I thought, okay, this is not good for General Magic. So that's number one. The other thing was that I was sorely disappointed in the products that came out, and frankly, I couldn't see how I could help it change. I just didn't see what could I do. How can I help this succeed? And at a time when I couldn't see that, I thought, I can't stay on. They better get somebody else who can, fresh blood or, newer thinking or whatever, somebody who has a way to see past the obstacles. I was just getting mired in the obstacles. So I think that those were the main reasons.
One minor question, I think, but Philips in the Netherlands was important in Wi-Fi.
Right.
But that was not the part of Philips you were dealing with. Okay.
Yeah.
And then what?
Oh, may I ask a question about the partners, just before we leave that? Several times, partners were clearly an important impetus for you deciding ultimately to leave, but also as part of the strategy for the company.
Right.
You mentioned a couple of times that Sony you put separately, Sony Japan as a saint. What differentiated both them as partners as well as the relationship with you?
They had a great team. Their team was really good, and very different from all the others. Very committed, working long hours along with us. Unlike the others who were, strictly 9 to 5 kind of people, or some of the others who were 9 to 5 people. They were just willing to put up with so much, waffling on our part, and Sony had this dedication to product quality, and we would sneak something in at the last minute after all the quality control was already supposed to be done. I mean, that happened several times, and they were just incredible, and they would, turn on a dime and do what they needed to do. So they were really committed, and they were really working very, very hard. So this was Sony Japan and their engineers and their product managers.
The Palm Top was in that rough period, right? The Sony Palm Top.
You know, I don't recall.
Okay.
I don't
So that
remember.
wasn't, you weren't interacting with that team specifically?
No,
All right.
no.
And then, so after General Magic, what did you do next?
After General Magic, so I took some time off, and then I started working on nonprofits. So working in educational nonprofits and environmental nonprofits. So I was working with an environmental think tank called Redefining Progress that was working on the pollution legislation and climate legislation in California. And that group was working with the governor and the legislature to pass some of the legislation that we have today in California on various climate initiatives. So, so that was really important to me. So since then, I've been doing mostly nonprofit work and also helping any startups that come to ask for help, whether with business plans or what have you, but not in the past several years, because I really feel that the industry has moved into a space that I no longer am completely in touch with from the industry point of view. I use their products, but I am not as up to date to be able to provide any kind of constructive advice on the creation side.
And then your husband, Alain, went and created, what was it, WAP with Unwired. What's the
right. The company changed names several times. It was Unwired Planet,
right.
And then Phone.com, and so on.
Now that seems, I mean, that became very influential, but it's kind of the opposite end of, say, the General Magic or the Go vision.
Right,
right. So how did, I mean, at this point you guys could talk about it, I assume.
Right. Yeah, Alain was convinced that the right thing. He actually had told people that most people are going to be texting each other much more on these devices than they're even going to be talking from the very beginning. And he also, you know, his thing was the internet in your pocket. He was very focused. He thought the grander visions right now cannot be realized because the technologies aren't quite there yet. So, but internet in your pocket with very focused and limited capability, we can do that. So that's what he focused on, which was, but you know, I was kind of like, oh, that's not this huge grand thing, but millions and millions of people used it. So, yeah. So it's kind of funny when we watch our children going on and on their phones, like
one hand in the pocket, actually, right?
Oh, one hand in the pocket, and Alan looks at me and smiles, like, you see?
But they're using phones that have some of the features now that General Magic was trying to do.
Of course, and that's, you know, that's Steve again. That is a vision that was worthy of Steve, and he made it happen. Yeah.
Well, today, thank you so much for your time. We had hoped to cover 3 topics. We covered 2, and we know that you need to go, so we want to be mindful of your time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I wanted to mention the thing several times as I was talking, and the reason I said curiosity, and it's the Russian word is любознательность, which is a very specific kind of curiosity, which is curiosity relating to knowledge, as opposed to curiosity relating to gossip or, you know. So, and I think for me, the guiding principle has always been, because I was intrigued by the leading edge technology, it was always this seduction. And I think if you're a product person and if you're in high tech, that thrill of seeing and knowing and being curious about the future is what guides you. And that is so profoundly satisfying that no matter how many times you lose and fail, the satisfaction of having, because I don't regret a minute of my time spent on General Magic, because it was just this incredible feeling of seeing the future, being within a grasp, trying to identify the most leading edge technologies and understanding how they work and what can and cannot be done. That is so profoundly satisfying to somebody who's a product person, you know, that it's worth everything.
Perfect way to end today. Thank you so much, Joanna.